I know.
Restored something about that was cool.
There's that was the other thing on Friday. I had papers in my shit. It's the part of there, and they like her boyfriend.
All right, it's 1 o'clock. Let's go and get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Doing good. All right, so this is basically our last week, or the last week you'll hear me talk for 75 minutes. So I just have a couple more kind of topics and ethics. I feel bad kind of leaving these to the end just because I'd say these two are arguably kind of the more important ones, especially moving forward. So today we're going to go over environmental ethics. And then on Thursday, we're going to go over computer technology, ethics and what that really means, right? But next week, so we still have class next week, but all of next week is just going to be all project presentations. So that's going to be your guys' time to present. So we have 8 groups in this section of 401. So we're going to have half of the groups go on Tuesday and the other half on Thursday. So I haven't made the presentation schedule yet. I'm gonna do that right after class today. So basically, I have the list of all the projects. I have it on a sheet, and I'm just going to basically I have you all numbered from 1 to 8, and I'm just going to ask the internet to give me a random sequence from 1 to 8, and that's going to be the presentation order. So if your group number ends up on the first half, you'll go on Tuesday. If your group number ends up on the second half, you'll go on Thursday. Okay. So definitely, I meant to do that yesterday. I had some things I had to take care of yesterday. So I'm going to do that today, right after class. Okay. So you'll know, because I know you guys need that information for, sooner rather than later. Okay. So for your presentations, it is just a 15 to 18-minute presentation. Because we only have 8 groups, we shouldn't be too crunched on time, but again, I always really stress that you should practice your presentation. Tuesday or Thursday of next week shouldn't be the first time that you're all doing it together as a group. Make sure that you practice it so you know what you're talking about and you say it in the most time efficient way possible, right? Because hopefully what you guys are learning by doing these, hopefully you guys have already started kind of doing your research and everything, that there's a lot of information about all these case studies. There's a lot that you guys can talk about from a lot of different angles. And so, making sure that you, first of all, that you get all the information that you need, but also present it in a way that's kind of efficient and makes sense. Take some practice. And so make sure you guys leave some time to do that either over the weekend or early next week on Monday. Okay. So what I'm expecting for the presentation, so if I think I need to post the template or the template slides for the presentation. Basically, what I would like to see is that, your presentation slide should kind of organize your presentation into the different sections that are listed on the rubric. So that's basically all the template's going to be. And if you've never given a presentation like this before, generally, my advice to you is to kind of try to limit how much text that you have on the slides. The worst thing in the world is for someone to give you a presentation to have just a wall of text on the slide itself. Because then, as an audience member, you're either spending your time reading the slides or you're listening to them talk. And it's usually very difficult to kind of do both at the same time. So try to limit your slides to be just kind of a small amount of text, maybe just a few bullet points to kind of, just to kind of give you your main talking points, but then spend most of your time talking and discussing most of the things and going in detail that way. And then of course you can put images and figures on your slides as well. That's always helpful. So I expect the slides to look professional. So I expect them to just be, not just to use white backgrounds and kind of the default font. And so it should look professional, but also at the same time try to limit the amount of text that you put in. Okay. In the past, what I've had people do is that they basically just copied and paste, whole like pages from their report and put that on the slide. And that's usually not a good experience as an audience member. So, try to limit the amount of text, but then that kind of, that should really kind of emphasize how important it is to practice your presentation, so that you know exactly what you want to say and how you want to say it. Okay. Because the thing about presenting, and this is something that I still struggle with to this day too. It's one thing to go over the presentation in your head and think about, all right, I'm going to say it like this. I'm going to say it this way. And it's going to come out great. Actually having it come out your mouth and actually practicing it is a whole different story. There's definitely like a cognitive disconnect between, how you think things are going to go in your head versus how you actually say it in real life. So probably if you notice, probably every professor does this to some extent. There's some times where I kind of stumble over my words and things like that. And that's kind of where that disconnect occurs. My mind says one thing, but my mouth says another thing. And sometimes my pen says something else. And so you definitely want to practice it to make sure that you say things in the way. Okay. Okay, but you guys will I will put together the presentation schedule by this afternoon. All right. Any questions on any of that before we get started for today? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Oh, by the way, if you didn't pick up your midterms yet, I did bring them again today, so you can pick them up after class. Okay, so the topic for this week or for today is environmental ethics. All right. So this is particularly relevant, I think, for quite a few of your guys' projects, because your projects involve kind of some harm or some issue with the environment. Right? Okay. So let's talk a little history first. And so historically, engineers kind of have a somewhat complicated relationship with the environment. And so by the environment, I'm thinking about things like issues like climate change, issues like trees and the ocean and the air quality and things like that. Okay. And so the relationship that engineers have had historically with the environment is complicated. That's kind of the word that I like to use. Okay. Because on the one hand, a lot of people see, all of these kind of, human technologies, human kind of impact. A lot of the technology that we use that has a negative impact on the environment, engineers have worked on these. Okay. So things like cars, things like airplanes, these are all kind of, very classical kind of, engineering developed technologies. But these are kind of the main culprits that people think of when they think of, what are some human impacts, or what are some ways that humans are harming the environment, right? So all these airplanes, cars, polluting the air, making things, changing the climate and things like that. Okay. But on the other hand, you can say that, because a lot of these technologies are the ones that are harming the environment, it's really only the people with the technological background that can develop better technologies to help make our natural world a better place. Okay. So technologies like renewable energy, right? So there's a big push, especially in California for renewable sources of energy, solar, wind, right? Of course, engineers are going to have a big impact on those as well. Developing better cars, like electric cars that don't produce nearly as much emissions, right? Even in the relatively short amount of time that automobiles have been on planet Earth, right? We've made gigantic strides in terms of how much negative emissions and negative kind of pollution that those cars produce, and engineers have had basically a hand in all of that, right? And so engineers are both responsible for creating this technology, but also are also going to be a big part of the solution as well, right? And as we head, and as we head into the future, engineers are going to play a much bigger role because the natural environment is getting a lot more attention because we're doing more and more research. We're getting more and more information each day about kind of this path that we're on in terms of climate change. Okay. 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 And I think generally, the newer generation of engineers are, or at least, more aware of these issues. And so, and there's a lot of projects that are going on, both from kind of from the university level, but even at the professional level at this point to do that. Okay. All right. And so the question to ask at this point is, what kind of professional obligation do engineers have towards the environment, right? We've so far in this class, we've talked about kind of the obligations that engineers have to protect human safety, right? We spent a lot of time talking about risk and health and safety and how important that is. Last week we spent the entire time talking about the engineer's responsibility to their company. Okay. So, that kind of begs the question of what kind of responsibilities do engineers have towards the environment, right? Because on the one hand, it's good to be aware of these things and to kind of work to improve it, but what kinds of, what are we kind of compelled to do? What are we responsible for? Okay. And so to answer that question, the first place that we always look is we look at the professional codes, right? So we look at IEEE, we look at NSPE, every other kind of engineering society and see what they say about the environment. Right? Okay. And so if you look up the professional codes, things that might be a little bit different now, just because a lot has kind of changed over the last 5-6 years in terms of the environment. But if you read the professional codes and you compare how much the professional codes say about human safety and ethics in terms of that versus the environment, there's actually very little that the professional codes say about the environment. Part of the reason for this is that the exact impact of certain technologies on the environment is very kind of field dependent. And so if you're writing kind of professional engineering codes for just all of engineers in general, it's hard to write kind of specific rules just because then the professional codes kind of get out of control. If there's strict regulations in terms of how much pollution that you can make and how do you define pollution, things like that, it gets kind of a little bit out of hand. But the other reason, there's not that much to say about in the professional codes is that, at the end of the day, the professional codes or the way they're written is they're, written with the kind of the number one priority of protecting human life, at least in the immediate future. And with the environment, while the environment, I think, our perception of the environment has certainly evolved a lot over in the last few years. But the environment, sometimes is seen kind of separate from human safety. Granted, a lot of the issues with the environment are going to have a big impact on human health and safety. We're kind of seeing that kind of unfold in real time right now with all this climate change that we've been experiencing. But the thing with a lot of environmental issues is that, they don't really affect human safety immediately. So yes, eventually climate change will have a big negative impact on human society, right? But it's not something that happens kind of today, right? Whereas on the one hand, if you design a faulty car like the Pinto, right, and the Pinto explodes, that has a direct negative impact on the humans that use that device immediately, right? But if you develop a car that spews a lot of toxins into the environment, probably the effects of that are not going to be felt and for another maybe year, at the earliest, maybe 5 years, 10 years, something like that, right? Actually, a lot of the issues that we're facing right now with the environment, are issues that were created, maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so we're kind of really feeling those effects right now. Because the environment is not something that changes, as quickly as some things. And so the environment is kind of seen as something that's separate, not really kind of directly intrinsically tied to human health. You'll probably see the professional codes maybe throw in maybe one statement or so on the environment, but it's not treated with the same level of urgency as human health. Okay. And so because of this, really kind of a lot of the history in terms of of engineering companies and the environment, have the government involved in some way. So usually, for the most part, in order for engineering companies to do something differently to kind of protect the environment, the federal government or the state governments have to get involved, right? So what we're going to talk about today, there's been a lot of court cases, there's been a lot of pieces of legislation, and it's usually not until these things are passed that the engineering companies actually do something about what they're doing. Because a lot of engineering companies are usually not going to proactively change what they do to protect the environment, because usually protecting the environment does not lead to a better bottom line for them, right? And that's despite all the marketing that you see out there about certain companies. Honda really cares about the environment, things like that. They only really had to do that because in response to the laws kind of cracking down on them. So a lot of the relationship that we have, as engineers with the environment, there's usually some kind of court case or usually some kind of piece of legislation that's involved. And with the short amount of time that we have, it's kind of impossible to have a comprehensive look at absolutely everything. But if you kind of read the history or kind of look up and say what are some influential court cases, that have to do with and like usually it's some government regulating body like the EPA versus some company that's trying to do something. There's a very long and very storied history behind. Okay. So today we're going to talk about just a little bit of it. So probably some of the more influential pieces of legislation. But But just know that there's a lot of things. Okay? And the main thing that complicates things is that, a lot of environmental issues, they don't really affect human health until, much, much later. So it's a little bit hard to, you know, to change processes because of that. Okay. All right. Any questions on this so far? Okay. All right. So let's talk about that. So let's talk about the federal government and the environment. And we're specifically talking about the US at this point. Okay. So, just like I mentioned before, so, usually it's not in the company's best interest, at least not financially, to protect the environment, right? Especially because a lot of these engineering companies, the really kind of really big ones that were established, kind of in a time when we weren't really aware of a lot of the environmental issues. And so changing what they do to protect the environment is usually going to cost them a lot of money. It's going to cost them a lot of, time to address these kinds of things. Okay. Usually what tends to happen is that, these companies have been doing doing things a certain way for a long time. The government steps in and says, you can't do this like this anymore because it's hurting the environment. And so the company kind of reluctantly kind of changes what they do. And then kind of months or years later, after everyone's kind of forgotten about that, then they try to spin their marketing in terms of, oh, our company really cares about the environment. So they try to take advantage of it in terms of market appeal. That's usually kind of what happens with these things. Companies are not kind of, proactively, helping the environment. They only do so if they can kind of make money off of it in some way. And so in order for this to happen, the government most of the time has to step in and to do something. Okay. Surprisingly, no one's doing this project this year, but I think the BP oil spill was kind of a very classic example of this. So they were kind of responsible for one of the biggest environmental disasters of kind of the modern times. But somehow, they kind of waited the perfect amount of time for everyone to kind of forget about that. And they put out all this kind of positive marketing, all this positive advertisement for the things that they're doing for the environment. And somehow it worked. And people forgot that they were responsible for like the worst oil spill in history. But I guess that's the power of good marketing. I guess that's kind of what you pay them for, right? Okay, so let's go over some of the highlights or some of the most important laws that have passed that have kind of the most impact in terms of engineering. Okay, so we'll start in 1969. Okay. And so in 1969, Congress passed what's called the National Environmental Policy Act. Okay, and so with this act, this was kind of a really kind of landmark piece of legislation because this was kind of the first time that the government has kind of taken this stance of kind of really protecting the environment. And a lot of what we do today in terms of environmental legislation was kind of inspired by this. Okay. All right. So what the National Environmental Policy Act, what it basically declared was that it declared that a national policy to encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and its environment. And that's directly quoted from the act itself. Okay. And if you think about the time period in which this act came out, this is kind of right before the 70s, where it was obviously a very big thing at the time. Okay. So this kind of set the stage for a lot of kind of I would say kind of people's feelings about the environment, about how we should protect it, but also kind of sets the stage for a lot of kind of future legislation as well. Okay. Okay. And so the biggest practical thing that came out is that this established the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency within the federal government. Okay. So the EPA was established primarily to enforce all the mandates that came out of this act. So with this, the EPA was granted authority to create legislation or create regulations that companies have to adhere to protect the environment. And it also gave them basically the power to sue a lot of companies through the judicial system to enforce a lot of these things, right? So a lot of the lawsuits that have occurred throughout the last 50 years, it usually involves the EPA to some degree. So the EPA is usually suing someone to have them follow the rules, or a company is suing the EPA because they interpret the rules a little bit differently. Okay. And there's kind of a very kind of rich history from that. But 1969 is kind of when a lot of this kind of started, when the national government kind of, they kind of put their foot forward and said that, we are going to protect the environment as a nation, and we're going to dedicate government resources to do that. And that established the EPA, which is kind of a lot of, where a lot of things came from. Okay. So another really important piece of legislation that came out right after this was in 1970. And so in 1970, Congress passed an act called the Clean Air Act. It was kind of the first really major piece of legislation that the EPA kind of put out. So Congress developed this alongside with the EPA, and this placed a lot of regulations in terms of what kinds of pollutants we can put into the air. Because it was kind of around this time that a lot of research and a lot of discoveries are being made that a lot of the whole coal industry, the automobiles that we had, they're producing a lot of these pollutants that were having a very negative impact on the environment, right? And so the Clean Air Act was developed to kind of start to put some regulations on this to kind of limit that pollutant production. Okay. So this was also kind of important too, because, not only was it kind of the first really major thing that the EPA did, was that, this was kind of one of the very first times that, the government really did something proactive to place the health of the environment and the humans above the commercial success of the companies themselves. Okay. It was kind of, the first time that the government said that, companies, you have to be on board with protecting the environment, even if it costs you kind of your bottom line, right? And so if you can't operate a company profitably while protecting the environment, then we're just not going to let you have your company, basically. Okay. All right. So the last one that I want to talk about, at least for now, we're going to fast forward 20 years in 1990. The year I was born. In 1990, the government passed an act called the Pollution Prevention Act. This act was really important because it kind of shifted our focus in terms of how can we best kind of protect the environment in terms of kind of our daily acts and what companies should do. Because up until this point, all throughout the 70s and all throughout the 80s, the general policy or the general strategy was to try to manage try to simply manage the pollution as much as possible. So the pollution is there, we produce it, we're going to try to manage it as best as possible. Okay. And so we kind of accepted the fact that we produce pollution and we try to just either put it all in one place or kind of manage it to a degree where it's not affecting human life, right? But it's kind of at around this time that we start to realize that that strategy does not really, it's not going to be really feasible in the long term, because we're going to keep producing pollution if we don't do something, and then eventually we're just going to be overwhelmed with all of that. Okay. So with the Pollution Prevention Act, this kind of set in motion a lot of other kind of smaller pieces of legislation to kind of shift the focus. So instead of kind of managing pollution, then this act really put an emphasis on, let's prevent the pollution from getting there in the first place. Okay. So a lot of the focus of this act actually had to do with garbage, actually, right? So maybe you guys are a little bit too young for this, but I remember growing up in the 90s, there was a huge push for doing the 3 Rs, which are reduce, reuse, and recycle, right? So reduce the amount of waste that you produce, reuse whatever you can, right? If you have a plastic bottle, try to use that as much as you can. Don't just buy a new one, and recycle what you don't use, right? So people usually forget the first two R's, and so people just kind of jump to the recycle. And so if you drink like a bottle of soda, you throw it in the recycle bin, you're like, oh, I'm doing something good for the environment, right? But a lot of emphasis was kind of placed on the first two R's to, not only reduce what you use, but also reuse what you have, so we don't have to keep producing more and more garbage, don't have to produce more and more waste, things like that. Okay. So obviously there's been a lot more. There's been quite a few recently that have been passed in terms of maybe not as landmark as these, but there's the commitment from a lot of the kind of the global countries to be carbon free by a certain date, to be waste free by a certain date, to have fully renewable energy by a certain date, 2030, 2040, things like that. And so there's definitely been a lot more that's happened recently. But at least in terms of in terms of kind of shaping our current policies, shaping our current attitudes, these three are probably kind of the three more important ones to know. Okay. All right, any questions on this? Okay. All right, so the federal government, has a big hand in deciding our regulations, so those are important to know. But of course, like I mentioned, most companies are not going to go quiet, right? And so if you tell them to do something differently, that's going to affect their bottom line, they're going to fight back. And the main way that people fight back in this country is to take it to court. So there is a very, very even just a short amount of time that we've made the environment an issue. There's been many court cases about the environment, and a lot of those kind of set the precedent in terms of how these types of situations are dealt with. Okay? So let's talk about that a little bit. So let's talk about court decisions about the environment. All right, so many lawsuits have occurred. And usually those lawsuits have one or two different flavors. So sometimes those lawsuits, they occur because the EPA mandated something, but the company doesn't agree with it. And so they sue the EPA to kind of, to try to change the rules. Okay. Or the other situation where this tends to occur is that the EPA mandated something, but a company is not following the rules. And so in order to get the company to follow the rules, the EPA then sues the company. Okay. And the EPA isn't the only government body that does this too. There's a lot of smaller agencies within the government, sometimes state governments. States also have the ability to kind of pass their own laws. California is one of the more progressive states in terms of that, in terms of passing laws to protect the environment. So oftentimes, you'll have lawsuits between the state government, maybe the California version of the EPA, and certain companies in order to get them to comply with certain. But there's been a lot of different court cases. Okay. Okay. All right. So a lot of these court cases kind of boil down to a kind of a relatively the same kind of core argument, which is that while it is the government's responsibility to protect its people, its protect its citizens, and protect the environment, it also has to do its due diligence in terms of applying these rules in a way that makes the company kind of still financially viable as well, right? And so that's kind of the core argument with a lot of these cases. And while that may seem kind of like a, kind of like a little bit of a controversial statement, um, you know, these companies, even though, we're talking about, I know today we're kind of talking about the companies in a way where, they're going to cut corners, they're going to, trash the environment whenever they can. The reality is, these companies, people rely on them as well. Because these companies are a big part of our economy and people need to make money in order to purchase their goods, right? I think when we think about companies, we always tend to think about the people in charge, those the CEOs and the executives that are making kind of really exorbitant salaries. And so, when a company gets taken down, it's like, yeah, we're really sticking it to Jeff Bezos that time. But a lot of other people kind of rely on these companies as well. Because it's very easy, for the government to say, we're going to be completely carbon free tomorrow, right? And so starting tomorrow, no carbon emissions, you can't drive your cars or anything like that. Right? You can imagine kind of the chaos that's going to ensue. So not only is, people are not going to be able to drive, get to work, but, all these companies that rely on delivery, logistics, supply chain, things like that, none of that will be able to function. And so, the government kind of is kind of forced into a situation where they kind of have to do things in a certain way to kind of, try to make things kind of best for everyone. And a lot of times there's no kind of easy way or there's no kind of simple way to do it. And so, whenever you make a change, or even if you don't make a change, it's going to be hurting someone to some degree. Okay. And so the government has to kind of really be careful in terms of how heavy-handed it is in applying these rules, because it is going to have a lot of negative consequences, if you are a bit too heavy-handed. Okay. So just because of time, we don't have time to go through kind of the details of a lot of these. I'm going to list out kind of some of the more influential court cases that have that have kind of shaped our policy up until this point. And I always, I never like it to say that, I'm going to list these things and then like you say, oh, go look it up yourself. But that's kind of all that we kind of have time for. So you'll notice that a lot of these are in the 70s. Because the 70s, like we mentioned, the 70s is when the EPA was first established. And so, that was kind of a big kind of seismic shift in terms of how governments kind of participate in protecting the environment. So a lot of court cases kind of sprung up around that time. Just because, part of it was the EPA kind of just kind of learning to, come into its own and trying to see what works best. But also just before that time, there were a lot of companies that were already established and doing things in a certain way that all of a sudden had to change because now the EPA exists. Okay, so the first one that's interesting, this is actually has to do with a skiing club in terms of how they were kind of running their operations. This is Sierra Club versus Morton of 1972. All right, another influential one. This one was a dispute between kind of one of the smaller agencies within the FDA, or excuse me, the EPA, the Atomic Energy Commission. So this is Calvert Cliffs Coordinating Committee versus the Atomic Energy Commission. It's from 1971. Another really interesting one. This one actually doesn't directly involve the EPA, but it actually involved a lot of just normal citizens in a certain area, kind of opposing what a certain company was doing to the natural environment around them. So this is Citizens to Preserve Overton Park versus Volk. That was also 1971. So just right after the EPA was established. Okay, I'll list one more. This one's a very more recent, but also very fascinating if you see kind of the combatants of this lawsuit. This is the state of Massachusetts versus the EPA. 2007. Right? So fairly recent. Okay. This is I think a bit more common in kind of the political environment that we have today. Kind of state governments or state agencies suing the federal government under the judicial system to because they have a disagreement. I don't remember the exact details of this one, the Massachusetts versus the EPA one. I believe it had something to do with fishing boats in terms of what kind of fuel that they can use and what kind of impact it has on the environment. But I don't remember exactly kind of the details for that one. Yeah. So I have a few more that's listed in the notes, but at this point it's just kind of listing them. In the past, what I've done is I've kind of made into a class activity where I have handouts for these and I give them out. But with kind of the new format of lecturing on Zoom, half you guys are here, half you guys are on Zoom. It's a little bit hard to do that. So I'm just going to list these out. If you're interested, I would definitely check them out. The really cool thing is that because all of these disputes have played out in the judicial system, basically everything is really well documented. So you'll be able to find a lot of really good information. In fact, you can actually read the court briefings about these too. So you can actually read the exact arguments that the lawyers used in kind of their unedited form. I mean, granted, these are very long documents, but they're also very kind of fascinating to read through as well. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this so far? Okay. Okay. Let's see. So let's talk a little bit about the companies, right? So obviously the companies have an obligation to protect their own financial interests. But now that the environment is becoming a much bigger issue, it's garnering a lot of public public interest, a lot of public support. It's starting to become in the company's own best interest to do things to protect the environment as well. And so a company can take different stances in terms of how they go about protecting the environment or how they go about doing their own business and what impact that has on the environment. So I'm going to list kind of three different types of attitudes, and so these are kind of very similar to our discussion about company culture. And so maybe the company that you work for doesn't quite fit into one of these, but the idea is to kind of give you these three kinds of different attitudes to kind of maybe kind of elucidate or kind of expand on why a certain company may do things the way that they do. Okay. So the first type of attitude or the first approach that a company can have is to what's called I call the sub-minimal attitude. Right. And so companies with this kind of attitude towards the environment, they will do as little as possible, sometimes less so, if they can get away with it, to protect the environment. So these are the type of companies that wait until the government makes a law before they actually do it. And in fact, a lot of these companies actually invest a lot of money to lobby the government to stop them from passing such laws. So, these are usually the companies that are kind of directly involved in those kinds of things. Okay. Okay. And so, what did this look like? And so this, these companies often, like I mentioned, they hire lobbyists to kind of push forward their agenda, making sure, certain laws don't get passed, or, maybe laws are passed in a certain way that don't negatively impact them. Okay. They also have no full-time personnel, or maybe just very little personnel, devoted to, environmental issues. And some of these companies, even if there are regulations against them, some of these companies would kind of have the attitude of, it's better to just break the law and pay some fines rather than change what we do. So these are the type of companies that do kind of try to do as little as possible. Most of the time, the reason companies have this attitude is obviously financially, right? But sometimes there could be some other reasons as well, maybe longer held beliefs of whoever's in charge of the company. All right, number two. The number two type of attitude is kind of just one step above this, although not by much, which I call a compliance type of kind of approach. Okay. So kind of the general kind of attitude of these types of companies is that, yes, they know that the government is applying these rules and they'll comply with them just because, they just see it as kind of the most effective and kind of straightforward way to conduct business. And so these companies have devoted resources to kind of helping make sure that they do things in a way that's environmentally friendly, but they just kind of really just see it as another cost of business. Okay. But they're not happy about it. And in fact, a lot of times it's very clear that they're not happy about it. So these firms will hire staff, they'll hire people to kind of address these environmental concerns, but they're not that enthusiastic. They're just basically just doing it just because they're being told to. Okay? All right, number three. And so the third type of approach is what I call a progressive approach. So these companies are very sensitive to environmental issues and kind of proactive in terms of changing how they do things, if they find out that what they're doing is harmful to the environment. Usually, companies that are in this category, it's a part of their culture. So, the CEO has probably come out and made a lot of statements of, we're going to protect the environment, and that's going to be baked into everything that we do, right? So these kind of have part of their company culture is protecting the environment. Okay? And so, they fully fund, their environmental office, their environmental officers. They are constantly kind of looking for things like how to improve, things like that. Okay. These companies generally have a good relationship with the government regulators. It's not like a relationship of like, a strict teacher and a misbehaving student. It's kind of, these are kind of the teacher's pet students, I guess you can kind of say, right? They're the ones that try to kind of proactively kind of do things so that the government regulators don't get upset at them. Okay. And so generally these companies tend to see themselves as the good neighbor, with not only with the environment, but also with the regulators as well. All right. And just like a lot of things that I've mentioned in this class, I think generally public perception is starting to, on average, kind of be a bit more progressive towards environmental issues. So people generally like to see that the companies that they give their money to, what they shop at, are doing what they can to protect the environment as well. And companies have picked up on this, and so they picked up that it's good marketing to tell people that you're good with the environment. And so, a lot of commercials, a lot of marketing that you will see is companies will try to market kind of the environmental things that they do. But whether or not they actually are good for the environment overall, it's kind of a case by case basis. But company kind of try to use this as good marketing as much as possible. Okay. But that's kind of an important trend to realize, is that generally speaking, people are becoming more and more aware of environmental issues, and they want to see the environment kind of be put into a good place. Okay. And I think that trend will definitely continue into the next generation. So your guys' generation, the generation that comes after, I think more and more people are going to become more aware of environmental issues, and have that be a more important part of kind of what they do. Okay. All right. Any questions on this so far? Okay. And so with that said, there's a lot of kind of good reasons for a company to be or start to become more and more progressive. As society starts to evolve, and people become more aware, the workforce tends to evolve as well, and people's tastes tend to evolve. It's trending in a direction where it's going to be good for a company to kind of take a more progressive stance. Okay. Okay. So the first reason, you know, believe it or not, kind of contrary to a lot of what we've been talking about today, it is actually in the company's best interest to try to be more progressive, be a bit more proactive in protecting the environment. And so on the one hand, if you're trying to sell a product, part of the marketing nowadays, like we mentioned, is to talk about the environment, talk about how, maybe your device, your technology is good for that, right? But even on the other side, right? A lot of companies, over the course of the last 50 years, they've run into a lot of really costly fines and really costly lawsuits with the government. And so generally, it's a good idea to try to avoid those lawsuits as much as possible. So one way, one way that progressive people are kind of market this kind of approach is to say that, yes, it may cost you some money now to kind of change what you do and make things better for the environment, but it's going to save you more money in the long run because you're going to avoid, these lengthy legal battles that could cost you a lot of money and lawyers. It could cost you paying a lot of fees and fines to the government, right? And so, by complying early on and kind of making the change early on, you can do something that's better for the company overall in the long. Another reason this is good too is that generally, with the way things are trending right now in the world, one can generally expect that a lot of environmental regulations are just going to get more and more strict with time. Okay? In general, right? So, there may be kind of smaller fluctuations depending on who's in power or not, but generally speaking, over time, as we learn more and more about kind of human impact on the environment, these regulations are only just going to get more strict with time. Okay. And so by investing money in the research, investing money in the development of technologies that are good for the environment, will kind of give these companies kind of a head start on the markets of tomorrow, right? Look and see kind of what's happened with the electric vehicle market, right? So Tesla kind of had a huge head start in terms of this, in terms of developing this line of cars that are all electric, right? And it took a really long time for a lot of other companies to kind of catch up with this technology. And I think nowadays, I think you're starting to see a lot more other companies kind of pop up. A lot of the big auto manufacturers are kind of catching up with their own electric vehicles, but Tesla had such a huge head start in that field that they were able to kind of, gobble up a huge market share in terms of that. So you see people driving Teslas around more than any other electric vehicle around, and that's because Tesla kind of invested the money early in terms of developing this technology and really marketing it and really kind of going all in on it. Okay. The next reason why it's good for companies to kind of have this kind of progressive approach is to promote well-being. So this is when I say well-being, I mean kind of well-being of kind of society in general. So people generally like to see a good environment, but even more immediately, it's a good idea for companies to do this so that their own employees are happy. I think, in general, a lot of people have just a natural affinity towards the natural world, right? Going on a hike or going to the beach, going to the forest, going camping, these are all things that a lot of people really enjoy. And a lot of things that people do to kind of, de-stress and kind of get away from kind of the, their everyday lives. And so, making sure to protect the environment and making sure that these habitats, these places are protected is good, just for good morale, just overall, right? Happy employees will be productive employees, and happy customers will spend money on your company, right? So investing in that and cutting down waste is something that's really important. Okay. All right. So another activity that I had originally planned, which obviously today we don't have much time for, but I would look into a lot of the companies that you see every day. So companies like Starbucks, like IKEA, Apple, Walmart, Chevron, and it's looking into these companies in terms of what their particular stance is on the environment, what they say publicly on their websites and what their own marketing versus what they've done, maybe some of the court battles that they've been involved in. It's very interesting. And a lot of these companies nowadays have a very interesting and not so stellar history with the environment, right? But you're also seeing a lot of really other interesting companies come up nowadays too. So I think a really big trend nowadays is plant-based meat. So Beyond Meat, Impossible Meat, right? These are kind of bigger companies that are just kind of starting up and really kind of gaining a lot of momentum very quickly. So looking at kind of thinking about kind of what we talked about today and applying that to a lot of the companies that are out there is a really interesting kind of study to do. All right, any questions on this? Okay. All right, so last thing I want to talk about today is we have time for it. I think we'll end it here. So I think this is kind of a good spot to leave it at. So I'll let you guys go a little bit early, but hopefully what you gain from today is there's a very long history in terms of a lot of things that happened in kind of a relatively short amount of time with engineering companies and the environment. And it's a conversation, and it's a situation that's going to continue to evolve over the years. And so being aware of these kinds of issues and knowing kind of what impact your work has is something that's going to be really important. So yeah. So we'll come back when we come back on Thursday. Thursday is going to be the last time that I'm going to be lecturing for this class. Thursday, we're going to talk about computer and technology ethics, so computer coding, social media, privacy, a lot of that good stuff that we're going to talk about. Okay. All right, so thank you guys for coming today. Remember to keep an eye out. So I'm going to send an email today about the presentation schedule for next week. So make sure you guys keep an eye out for that, and then start preparing for the presentation. So thank you guys for coming today. Hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and I will see you on Thursday. Oh, and if you haven't picked up your exam yet, I have it up here too.
I have a question unrelated to any of this.
Yeah.
Do you know of any good websites where I can find airfoils about the Concorde? Nobody knows.
Oh,
It's
great question, actually.
so hard.
Yeah.
I've combed and everyone's like,
only the engineers that have worked on it, and we're like, great,
Yeah.
thanks. I don't know why we picked this plane.
It's, yeah, it's interesting actually, because you would think it's such a famous plane that a lot of that is kind of published at this point.
Yeah,
But maybe it is still within, like, it's still proprietary to the company.
yeah.
So, yeah, I'm not sure. I've never actually thought about that. If I come across anything, I'll let you know. But nothing really comes to mind. Have you tried like a scientific paper by Google Scholar?
Yeah.
Nothing comes up on that too?
Nothing comes
Okay.
up on it, like NASA's written like briefly about it, but that was about it, but it was more about, just planes in general, going through Mach 1, or like under whatever Mach 2, but,
But not specifically the Concorde.
not specifically the Concorde.
Mm.
And there's been other companies that have kind of modeled their planes after the Concorde, but nobody's actually.
But no one's like had specific about the design.
No, and so like we're trying to find airfoils, it's for mechanical vibration.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we're kind of like stuck, so we have to ask our professor today
Yeah.
what she wants us to do, because if we can't find anything on it, we can't really run any simulations or
Right,
anything.
right. I would ask Dr. Myrol, he's probably the most knowledgeable about that.
Okay,
He's much more into aerospace than him. Yeah.
Okay.
So if anyone would know, he would.
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.